For years, Mrs. Thompson, my elderly neighbor, never acknowledged my greetings. Her distant demeanor was puzzling. I often wondered why she was so cold, but I respected her space. One day I heard she was in the hospital, and something urged me to visit her. She lay frail, yet there was a spark in her eyes. With a weak voice, she motioned for me to come closer, her next words revealing an unexpected truth. The beeping of machines attached to Mrs. Thompson interrupted the hospital room's quiet. She looked weak as she lay in bed. Her cheeks were sunken, and she breathed heavily. It wouldn't be long, I thought. As I sat down on the chair next to her bed, she slowly began to open her eyes, and was clearly surprised to see me, judging by her heart rate spiking on the screen. "Molly," she whispered, reaching out her hand. I was surprised Mrs. Thompson knew my name, so I leaned in, wondering what she would tell me. "I need you to know something," she continued, and I listened with bated breath. "Your father hired me to—" She began to cough, struggling to breathe. I rushed to press the emergency button, but it was too late. The world slowed down as nurses ran into the room trying to revive Mrs. Thompson. I was quickly ushered away, shielding me for the desperate rescue mission, but it was doomed to fail. Mrs. Thompson had crossed over, and I was left with more questions than answers. But why had Molly's father hired Mrs. Thompson? And for what? And why didn't Molly know? Arriving home, I felt lost and confused. I had just witnessed something I thought I would only see in movies. I was deep in thought as I threw my keys on the table, but the loud bang snapped me right back to reality. Suddenly I began to cry, letting out all the day's emotions. Once the tears flowed, there was no going back, but Mrs. Thompson's death wasn't the only thing I cried about. The mention of my father had thrown me off. I hadn't spoken to him in over a decade. He had left my mother and me when I was 10 years old without saying goodbye. Those first teenage years were the hardest of my youth. Seeing my mother so heartbroken that I couldn't even be sad myself, I had to be there for her. I had finally moved on and managed to live a life where I didn't think of my father every day. But now, he suddenly returned like a thunderbolt. My mind spun with reasons why my father would have hired Mrs. Thompson and what for, each thought crazier than the last. I know I couldn't just let this go. My father had tortured my thoughts for too long. My hand trembled as I pulled my phone out of my pocket and typed in my father's name. I hadn't spoken to him in so long. I wasn't even sure if he still used the same number. I held my breath as it rang, but my stomach quickly dropped, hearing a robotic voice telling me the number had been disconnected. Instead, I called my mother, hoping she could help me further. "Hi, dear," she happily said. Hearing her comforting tone, I immediately broke down, telling her everything. "Oh, Molly," she sighed. "I knew this would come up eventually." Instantly, I felt a pit form in my stomach. "What do you mean, Mom?" I asked, already fearing what she was going to say next. "We can't talk over the phone. They might be listening," she whispered, almost too soft for me to hear. My heart raced as I demanded that she come over that same day to tell me the truth, and she agreed. I paced the room, unable to sit still as I waited impatiently for my mother to come. Hours had passed when suddenly I heard a knock on my door, so I yanked it open, eager to let my mom in. "Mom, finally! What took you so low—" I began, but I stopped as soon as I saw it wasn't my mother standing before me. "Your mother won't be coming by today," a man wearing a black suit said sternly. "Stop looking or things will change in your life," he added, before turning around and walking away, leaving me in my door opening, too stunned to speak. I stood frozen at my door, staring down the hallway where the man in the suit had just been. My heart pounded, adrenaline surging through my veins. As his warning replayed in my head, it felt like I was trapped in a nightmare. My feet refused to move, rooted to the spot. Who was that man, and why had he come instead of my mother coming herself? I knew I had to act fast. My mother's warning echoed in my head. They might be listening. Her voice, filled with an urgency I'd never heard before, made my blood run cold. The cryptic message hinted at dangers I couldn't yet grasp. Was she in trouble? Was I? Questions swirled in my mind. The hallway seemed to stretch longer, shrouded in uncertainty. I took a deep breath, trying to muster the courage to make my next move. I closed and locked the door, pulling out my phone to try calling her again, but it went straight to voicemail. Each ring that went unanswered amplified my anxiety. "Mom, please pick up," I whispered to myself, desperation seeping into my voice. The silence on the other end was deafening. Leaving another voicemail seemed futile, but I had to do something. She had to hear me somehow. Feeling desperate, I decided to head to her house, avoiding the main roads and looking over my shoulder the entire way. Every shadow seemed menacing, every rustling leaf a threat. The man's warning echoed in my mind again. What did it mean? My pace quickened as paranoia gripped me. By the time I reached her street, I was nearly running, breathless with dread and anticipation. When I arrived, the house was eerily quiet. There were no signs of struggle, but something felt off. I hesitated at the front door, noticing how still everything was. Fear gnawed at me, but I turned the knob and cautiously stepped inside. The silence was unnatural, the air heavy with an unsettling calm. "Mom?" I called out, but the emptiness swallowed my voice. Where could she be? I found a note on the kitchen table which simply read, "Leave it alone." My heart sank at the sight of those words. The message was both cryptic and direct, leaving no doubt that whoever left it wanted me to stop my search. My hands trembled as I picked up the note, trying to make sense of it. Could this be from the man in the suit? Questions began to swirl in my head. My hands trembled as I clutched the note. Mrs. Thompson's cryptic message hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. It felt like the walls were closing in on me. I stared at the note, the words blurring through the haze of my growing anxiety. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing thoughts. Ignoring the note's warning wasn't an option. I had to find out what was happening. The next morning, I called in sick to work and went to the police, hoping they could help me find my mother. The station buzzed with activity, but it only amplified my sense of urgency. I felt small and insignificant among the hustle, but I forced myself to approach the front desk. Explaining my situation, I hoped for understanding and swift action. The uncertainty of what lay ahead gnawed at me. I spoke with an officer named Johnson, who listened intently, but seemed skeptical. His eyes flicked between my face and his notepad, and I could see the doubt etched in his expression. "Are you sure you're not overreacting?" he asked, his tone cautious. I shook my head vehemently, trying to convey the seriousness. He sighed, nodding slowly, and promised to follow up, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. "It's just a note. She could have gone somewhere on her own," he said. His casual dismissal only fueled my frustration. "You don't understand," I replied urgently. "She would never leave without telling me." He nodded again, more out of a need to placate than actual agreement. "All right, we'll file a missing person report," he said, jotting down the details. Despite this, I left the station feeling a sense of hollow accomplishment. Still, he agreed to file a missing person report. I clutched the edge of the desk, relief washing over me momentarily. Despite Johnson's skepticism, at least something was being done. He handed me a form to fill out, and my mind raced with every detail I could remember. I scribbled down everything: the note, the man in the suit, my last conversation with my mother. This had to lead somewhere. I handed him the note, and he promised to send someone to my mother's house for a welfare check. Johnson's eyes scanned the piece of paper, his expression unreadable. "I'll make sure this gets looked into," he assured me. His words sounded hollow, but I had no choice but to trust him. "Thank you," I replied, my voice trembling. Each second felt like an eternity as I awaited any sign of real action. With a sense of hollow accomplishment, I left the station, feeling more watched than ever. The weight of the situation pressed down on me, and every passerby's glance felt scrutinizing. I pulled my jacket tighter, trying to shake off the paranoia creeping up my spine. My phone buzzed with another missed call from work, but I ignored it. Finding my mother was all that mattered now. I walked briskly to my car, constantly looking over my shoulder. As I drove back home, I noticed a black sedan following me at a distance, but when I changed my route, it peeled off. My heart pounded as I zigzagged through the side roads, trying to lose my tail. Was it the same sedan from before? The coincidence seemed too eerie. Finally, after several tense minutes, I seemed to have lost them. Relieved but rattled, I made my way home, determined to keep a low profile. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to investigate Mrs. Thompson's house. The idea felt risky, but I had no other leads. Slipping into my best attempt at stealth mode, I approached her property under the cover of dusk. The familiar front porch now looked ominous in the fading light. My pulse quickened as I stepped up the creaky stairs, memories of her distant demeanor flashing in my mind. I had to find out what she knew. The door was locked, but I found a spare key hidden under a flower pot. My hands were shaking as I lifted the pot and saw the rusty key underneath. Trying to steady my nerves, I inserted it into the lock, and with a satisfying click, the door swung open. The air inside was musty, filled with the scent of age and disuse. I stepped in cautiously, half expecting someone to jump out at me from the shadows. Inside, the house was a maze of old furniture and dusty photographs. Each room added another layer to the story, but nothing that made immediate sense. The walls were adorned with an array of family portraits, their smiles frozen in time. The living room, cluttered with trinkets, seemed like a historical snapshot. My footsteps echoed softly, and I felt like an intruder in this labyrinth of memories. It was clear I needed to focus my search. In her study, I discovered a locked drawer in the desk. The room had a different aura, more private, guarded. I tugged at the drawer handle, but it didn't budge. My curiosity intensified. What could be important enough to keep under lock and key? I began rummaging through the desk, searching for the key. Time seemed irrelevant as I scoured the room, meticulously checking every nook and cranny. I had to find what she was hiding. Without thinking, I started searching for the key, and after what felt like hours, I found it taped under a shelf. My fingers brushed against the small, metallic object, and I pulled it free, feeling a surge of triumph. Holding my breath, I inserted the key into the drawer's lock and turned it slowly. A faint click echoed through the silent room. I opened the drawer, the contents within promising answers, or more questions. Inside the drawer there were letters and photographs, all featuring me. Shock rippled through my body as I rifled through the stack. Each photo captured moments I had nearly forgotten, bringing in the mail, walking to work, even mundane activities like grocery shopping. My heart sank with a mix of fear and confusion. Mrs. Thompson had been watching me for years. Why? What was so important about my life that warranted such scrutiny? Shocked, I rifled through them and found detailed notes on my daily activities. My heart raced as I read about my every move documented meticulously. Where I went, what I did, who I met. Mrs. Thompson had recorded everything. It felt eerie and invasive, like I had been living under a microscope. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Someone was watching. And it wasn't just Mrs. Thompson. I took the letters and photos back home, laying them out on my dining table, trying to make sense of it all. The pieces of my life, captured and cataloged by someone else, were now in front of me. The room felt suffocating with the weight of the revelations. Each photo, each note brought more questions. Who else was involved? And why was my life so important to them? Among the papers, I found a map with circled locations and dates that matched significant events in my life. The dates were eerily familiar. My high school graduation, my first job, even my recent birthday. The circles formed a pattern, but one I couldn't decipher. What were they pointing to? I felt a chill down my spine as I realized each location could be a potential clue. Could these locations hold more clues? The thought both terrified and intrigued me. Each circled spot on the map could unlock another piece of the puzzle. I couldn't ignore the impulses driving me forward. Despite the risks, I decided to follow the trail. Maybe one of these places had the answers I desperately needed. My eyes scanned the map again, plotting my next move. I decided to start with the nearest marked spot, a library downtown. The idea of public places felt a bit safer, though I knew I could never be entirely sure. The library had always been a quiet refuge in my younger days. Going back now felt like stepping into the past, carrying the weight of the present. I hoped this place would shed some light on my darkening situation. The old librarian seemed to recognize me, which was odd since I hadn't been there in years. Her eyes widened slightly as I approached the desk. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, her voice tinged with an unusual edge. The sensation of being watched gnawed at me again, but I forced a smile. "I'm looking for some old records," I told her, trying to keep my tone casual. When I hesitantly asked if she'd seen my father, her face tightened. She set down the book she had been holding and looked at me with a mix of caution and curiosity. "Why do you ask about him?" she replied, her tone guarded. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her gaze. "Just trying to find some information," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. But her reaction told me I hit a nerve. "You better be careful poking around," she muttered, glancing nervously around. Her eyes darted to the shadows as if expecting something, or someone, to emerge. My pulse quickened at her warning. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Some things are better left alone," she added, before turning away and busying herself with more books. The cryptic warning stirred my resolve even more. I couldn't back down now. Undeterred, I searched the archives for anything linked to my father, but found nothing concrete. I flipped through old newspapers and community records, my frustration growing with each dead end. Just as I was about to give up, an unexpected twist. I stumbled upon an article about a local identity theft ring. A name caught my eye, an alias my father had used. My heart raced as I realized I might be on the right track. Feeling increasingly paranoid and desperate, I turned to my closest friend, Mark, for help. Mark was a tech-savvy guy and offered to dig into the surveillance footage around my neighborhood and my mother's last known whereabouts. "If anyone's watching you, we'll catch them," he assured me. His confidence gave me a glimmer of hope. "Thanks, Mark," I said, grateful for his willingness to dive into this mess with me. Mark was a tech-savvy guy and offered to dig into the surveillance footage around my neighborhood and my mother's last known whereabouts. The intensity of the situation was palpable, but his calm demeanor provided a brief respite. "Are you sure you can find something useful?" I asked, trying to mask my desperation. "Absolutely, Molly," he responded with a confident smile. His certainty provided a sliver of hope in this surreal journey. "If anyone's watching you, we'll catch them," he assured me, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. Despite the chaos surrounding us, his confidence felt like a lifeline. We spent the next few hours sifting through hours of footage, marking any anomalies or suspicious movements. The data was overwhelming, but Mark's expertise kept us on track. "This isn't just a wild goose chase. We'll find something," he reiterated, fueling my determination. Later that evening, Mark called me, his voice tense. My heart skipped a beat as I answered, sensing that he had discovered something significant. "Molly, you need to see this," he said urgently. His serious tone left no room for questions. I felt a mixture of dread and anticipation as I hurried over to meet him. The weight of the day's findings hung heavily in the air as I prepared for the news. "Molly, I found something," he said, sharing a screen capture of a man in a black suit, leaving my mother's house just before I arrived. The image sent chills down my spine. This was the same man who had confronted me, his threat still resonating in my mind. "That's him!" I exclaimed, my voice tinged with both fear and anger. This evidence, albeit frightening, was a step closer to uncovering the truth. Another clip showed the same man lurking around Mrs. Thompson's house the night she was taken to the hospital. The footage was grainy, but the man's distinct suit was unmistakable. "It's like he's been tailing everyone connected to you," Mark observed, his brow furrowed in concern. My nerves were frayed, but this revelation only fueled my resolve. "We have to find out who this guy is and what he wants," I replied determinedly. With Mark's help, I revisited the library's archives, focusing on the timeline from the photos found at Mrs. Thompson's. The atmosphere was thick with suspense as we scoured through old records and articles, each piece potentially a clue. Mark's eyes scanned the documents with precision, his finger tracing over key dates and events. Each finding seemed to pull us further down the rabbit hole, but there was no turning back now. We discovered a series of news articles about a series of crimes related to identity theft in the late 90s, all pointing to a man who closely matched my father's description. The resemblance was unnerving. The articles painted a picture of a complex underworld activity, with my father potentially at the center. "This can't be a coincidence," I muttered, the pieces beginning to fit together. My father's past was coming into stark, startling focus. Each article had subtle connections to the locations circled on the map. The pattern was undeniable. Each place marked on the map corresponded to a significant event covered in the news articles. "It's like he was using these locations as safe houses or drop points," Mark speculated. The realization was both thrilling and daunting. We were on the brink of understanding my father's hidden life. But what did it all mean for us now? My pulse quickened as I found a headline: "Man wanted in connection with major identity theft ring." The words seemed to leap off the page. It felt surreal to see my father's possible crimes documented so plainly. This was more than I could have ever imagined. The gravity of it all made my head spin. "We need to dig deeper," I told Mark. There was no backing down now, only the need for more answers. Convinced my father was involved, I decided to dig deeper into his background. Mark and I gathered all the evidence we've found thus far: the surveillance footage, the archived articles, the cryptic note. We started cross-referencing everything, searching for hidden links. Mark's tech skills became indispensable as he hacked into databases and unearthed records. Our determination to uncover the full story was our driving force, and the next clue felt within our grasp. Mark found records of a storage unit rented under an alias that matched my father's description. The discovery felt like a small victory amidst a sea of unanswered questions. "This could be our golden ticket," I mused aloud. Mark nodded, his face serious. We both understood the risks, but the urge to uncover the truth about my father's hidden life and my mother's disappearance was too compelling to ignore. It could hold the answers we needed. My mind raced through possibilities: old documents, hidden stash, maybe even a clue that directly linked back to my mother. The dots we had connected so far hinted at something bigger, something dangerous. "We should be cautious," Mark advised. "But if we're right, this storage unit might unravel the entire web." I knew he was right. Every lead we've found seemed to point to this moment. Mark and I decided to visit the storage unit located on the outskirts of town. The plan was simple but risky. Our goal was to get in and out quietly. There's an underlying tension in the air, the kind that made your skin prickle with anticipation and fear. "We need to move fast," Mark said, glancing around to ensure we weren't being watched. I nodded in agreement, feeling the weight of our mission. We arrived late at night to avoid drawing attention, picking the lock and slipping inside. The storage facility was eerily quiet, bathed in dim, flickering light. My heart pounded as I heard the lock click open. With a careful turn, we pushed the door ajar and stepped into the unit. "Let's not linger," Mark whispered, the urgency in his voice mirroring my own apprehension. We needed to find those hidden secrets quickly. The unit was cluttered with old documents, fake IDs, and codebooks. The sight was overwhelming, like stepping into a time capsule of illicit activities. "Wow, your dad was busy," Mark commented under his breath, sifting through the scattered items. Papers fluttered as we searched hastily, hoping to uncover the specific piece of evidence that could tie everything together. The sheer volume of information crammed into the small space was daunting. Among the clutter, we found a journal with an entry dated the day my father left us. I felt a strange mixture of excitement and dread as I opened the worn leather cover. The handwriting was unmistakable, and for a moment I felt as if my father were right there with us. "This could be it," whispered Mark, his eyes fixed on the pages. We skimmed through, eager for any crucial information. It detailed his involvement in the identity theft ring, explaining he had to disappear to protect us. Each sentence felt like a revelation, unraveling the mystery that had haunted my life for years. "He wasn't just running away. He was hiding," I said, my voice trembling. The journal entries painted a picture of a man deeply entangled in a dangerous world, making difficult choices to shield his family from harm. Suddenly, bright lights flooded the unit. Men in black suits broke in, yelling commands. "Freeze!" one of them bellowed, the authority in his voice freezing my blood. Before I could react, we were surrounded. Mark and I exchanged terrified glances as they approached, their heavy footsteps echoing in the confined space. The journal slipped from my fingers, its secrets now exposed to forces we couldn't control. "What do we do?" Mark whispered urgently. We were handcuffed and taken away, our screams for answers echoing in the small space. The men in suits showed no signs of leniency, their grip firm and unyielding. "You can't do this!" I shouted, but my words fell on deaf ears. Mark struggled beside me, but we were quickly overpowered. The storage unit's secrets remained, locked away as we were forcibly marched out. I felt a deep sense of despair enveloping me. They took us to an undisclosed location, interrogating us separately. The room was cold and sterile, its walls devoid of any clues about where we were. Each question they asked felt like a trap, and every answer seemed to lead nowhere. Exhaustion and fear clouded my mind, but I held on to hope that Mark and I could find a way out. "Where is my mother?" I demanded, but their stony faces gave nothing away. Hours later, they put me back in a room with someone I never expected to see. My father. My heart nearly stopped as I took in his appearance. He seemed like a ghost from my past, materializing in front of me. For a moment, I forgot the urgency of our situation, lost in the disbelief of seeing him again. The room's air thickened with tension, neither of us daring to break the silence. He looked older, worn, and haunted. Deep lines etched across his face spoke of years filled with hardship. His eyes, once vibrant, now looked clouded with a mix of sorrow and fatigue. The years had not been kind, and it was clear he had been through a lot. Despite his disheveled appearance, there was a certain strength in his stance, as if he had been preparing for this moment. "Why did you hire Mrs. Thompson to watch me?" I demanded, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and confusion. The floodgates of my pent-up questions burst open. For so long I had wondered about his actions, and now I needed answers. He looked at me with profound sadness, as if my question had cut through him. His hesitation only intensified my need to know the truth. He sighed, explaining that he needed someone he could trust to protect me without drawing suspicion. It was never meant to be like this, he said, his voice heavy with regret. I had to ensure you were safe, and Mrs. Thompson was the only one I could rely on without putting you in direct danger. His explanation was far from satisfying, but it was the first piece of clarity I had received. Mrs. Thompson kept an eye on you to ensure I wasn't discovered, he confessed. The weight of his admission felt staggering. The old woman who had always ignored my greetings was actually a silent guardian. My mind raced, piecing together years of cold encounters with her. She had been my father's unseen ally, watching over me from the shadows, all to keep him from being found. In a twist I hadn't anticipated, he revealed that my mother knew everything. She had orchestrated my protection from afar. Your mother and I agreed on this plan, he said softly. She knew the risks, but believed that keeping you unaware would be the best way to ensure your safety. The realization left me reeling. They had both been involved in this elaborate scheme to protect me from a threat I never understood. The suited men, working for a rival faction, almost succeeded in making her disappear, but Mark and I had cracked the case just in time. You and Mark did well, my father acknowledged. If you hadn't intervened, they would have taken her before the truth could surface. Relief mingled with anger. The danger had been real, but at least we had managed to thwart their plans. A sense of urgency still lingered. We were eventually released, and I was reunited with my mother, ready to rebuild my life with answers. The relief of seeing her safe was indescribable. Embracing her, I felt a wave of emotions. Years of confusion and hurt began to make sense. My father's secret life, my mother's complicity, it all fell into place. We had much to discuss, but for the first time I felt we were on the same page. While many new questions remained, I felt a sense of closure and a renewed determination to move forward. There were still pieces of the puzzle to fit together, but I knew we could face them as a family. The shadows of the past had finally begun to lift, revealing a path forward. I looked at my mother and father, realizing that despite everything, we now had a chance to rebuild and find peace.